I'm here, nevertheless. So I just want to give an honor and glory to God for being here today, bringing me safely on the highway all the way up here. Some of you don't know, but I live 5.5 hours away from here. So I'm just thankful that I was able to come up here and speak with you. And it's actually an honor to be able to come up here and speak to you all.
Yes. Amen.
So a little bit about me. My name is Antonia Barnes, but I usually go by Nia. I am a licensed behavioral specialist. I'm a therapist. I'm a certified professional coach, and I've been in the human service and mental health field for several years, going on 19 years. Oh my gosh, I'm starting to tell my age now. But today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about trauma, okay? Yeah. And this is a topic that everyone has experienced before in their life, some form of trauma. And over the course of, my professional and both professional, and personal experience, I've experienced trauma. Okay. So trauma, I've got a look forward for you guys. So trauma, what is it? It's a deeply disturbing and distressing experience. Psychological trauma is an experience or event that occurs and overwhelms an individual's capacity to cope. Okay. And I wrote down some examples of trauma because I think it's important to provide examples because what may be traumatizing to me may not be traumatizing to somebody else. But the key thing I want you to understand is that trauma is something that affects one's inability to cope. Okay? So something like death of a child, abuse, any form of abuse. When we think about abuse, we typically think about physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, mental abuse. Those things are traumatic and they're trauma. Bullying, that's a new thing that, it's not new, but it's new in terms of the fact that it's brought, there's so many attention to it now in the schools. Bullying's been happening probably, who knows, back in the biblical times. A natural disaster. We think about the hurricane that happened in Puerto Rico or Hurricane Katrina. Those things were traumatic events and caused trauma for an individual. So when we talk about trauma, an event can lead to trauma if it occurs without warning. How many times do we actually plan for natural disasters? Do we plan to be abused? No, we don't. Events that you're not prepared to deal with. So let's take it a little bit personal. If you had a ending of a relationship or going through a divorce, that might be something you either did or didn't expect, but at the end of the day, it's still traumatic. It's a trauma. Events that left you powerless. Any form of abuse takes away your power. When I think about this, I think about rape victims and how they experience trauma. They're powerless against their attacker or the perpetrator. Negative events that occurred multiple times. This is called complex trauma. Complex trauma is something that happens occurring. So let's talk about, and I'll give you an example. Maybe you were in an abusive relationship and you were emotionally abused, you're physically abused. The chronicity, meaning it repeating itself over and over again, is complex trauma. Events that left you feeling remorseful or without a resolution. Sometimes we don't have a resolution to our problems or things that occur in our life, or something that you may have done can also be, not only does it affect the person who you may have done something to or offended, it affects you as well. All right, so risk factors. What puts us at risk for experiencing trauma? I'm gonna throw this out to the audience before I put my chart. Can anybody give me an example of what puts you at risk for experiencing trauma?
Not being aware of the signs.
Not being aware of signs. Not knowing your surroundings. Absolutely.
Love.
Love? Okay. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
You have like a low self-esteem or have
Absolutely. Bingo. Yes.
denial.
Denial. Denial is one of our strongest defense. I talk about that in my book that I wrote about. It's called Defenses Getting Out of Emotional Prison. And one of the things, and one of the chapters, I talk about a defense mechanism called denial. And that's one of our strongest defenses. Risk factors. An unstable or unsafe environment. I want to talk just a tad bit about this because I didn't go into detail my background, but I used to work for Children's Services here in Erie County before I left about 10 years ago. And I worked in sexual abuse, and I worked in foster care, and I worked in ongoing services. And oftentimes, people don't know when a child is removed from homes. There's a lot of mitigating factors that occur that allows a child to be removed from the home. But one of the things that we look at is whether or not that environment that they're in is safe. And when I'm talking about safe, I'm not talking about like they're free from physical attack. I'm talking about emotional abuse. I'm talking about coming home. Sometimes the kids don't know if they're gonna have a meal, the lights are gonna be on, you know what I mean? Or if they're gonna have to hide because one of the parents are abusive or allowing somebody to come in to be abusive. An unstable environment. Separation from a loved one. That could be, loss of a child, loss of a spouse, loss of a family member, or separation that you didn't plan. Serious illness. Unfortunately, some of us have experienced that when maybe a family member or loved one has had a serious health issue, and they've been suffering. Say if someone's dying of cancer, having to deal with that and knowing that that person is suffering and in pain, that's traumatic. That's traumatic for the person experiencing it and traumatic for the family member who loves that person who's going through it.
Yes.
Intense medical procedures, or having a family member who's had several surgeries. And it's traumatic for her because every time she thinks she's healthy, something else goes wrong. I mean, it could be plastic surgery. I mean, that's deep. Someone mentioned self-esteem. Who was it? Was that you that listened to self-esteem? 8 out of 10 times, people who have repeated plastic surgery are suffering from some type of low self-esteem or body image issues. So when we talk about, and your question was, does it matter if it's, plastic surgery? Absolutely. We can think of a couple of celebrities, Michael Jackson, you know what I mean? Little Kim, she's a rapper, you know what I mean? Who did a total transformation. Those people suffer from low self-esteem. And I talked about this: sexual, physical, emotional, and mental abuse, domestic violence. A lot of people don't know the seriousness of the trauma victims. When we think about trauma, a lot of people think about, okay, natural disasters or a car accident. Now, trauma, like I said, it could be anything that renders you powerless, anything that makes it difficult for you to cope with. It could be bullying. Children experience trauma, at a very, very young age, even as infants. Death, low self-esteem, drug and alcohol abuse or addiction, and multiple dating partners. People probably don't know about that. But sometimes when, say if you end a relationship and you turn around and get into another relationship, you haven't even healed or grieved what you just went through.
Right.
But the need to constantly be with somebody, to validate who you are. You don't need anybody to validate you. You're only validated by who you are in Christ.
Amen.
So why is this important? So I thought about this, and I wanted to really get people to understand the damage that trauma does, and if it's left unaddressed. So this is important because trauma can damage your brain. A lot of people don't know that. It can, I'm gonna get into that in a little bit. Your body, relationships, your personality, and your quality of life. I mean, if you are in constant fight or flight mode, what kind of quality of life would you have? Because you're always going to be on the defense. You're always going to think somebody's plotting against you. And the little thing can set you off. So you have a poor quality of life. I'm going to talk a little bit about how trauma affects the brain, because I think a lot of people don't know that. So I wrote a little note to myself because I knew I couldn't remember all this, but I'm going to break it down for everybody. It says the spectrum of negative life events or experiences directly affects how the brain functions. It causes negative physical changes to your brain, people. Trauma physically changes your brain. Okay? So there's such a loss of neurons in the hippocampus. The hippocampus is a part of your brain that's responsible for controlling your memory and your limbic system. Your limbic system deals with your emotions and your memory. Okay? But through the effects of cortisol, which is your stress hormone, trauma affects all of that. Therefore, stress and trauma changes the brain. So this is a little technical, but it's worth it. Trust me. Especially of those of us who are dealing with people who experience trauma and want to be helpful or assist them. So trauma and its impact on your brain. So I talked about the cortisol, which is a stress hormone. So in large amounts of it, it affects your cerebral cortex, producing arousal, delusions, anxiety, rage, and even psychosis. This is what trauma does, okay? It also suppresses your immune system, okay? So we wonder why, people are more susceptible to viruses, bacteria infections, and I want you to get it. I want you to get it. Trauma has this impact on you. So I talked about how trauma fundamentally changes how the brain operates. There are 3 parts of the brain it affects: the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. I know you're like, oh, this is all technical, but I'll break it down. So, substantial loss of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for your emotions, makes it harder to control your behavior. Okay? The amygdala is in your emotional center. Trauma increases the size when it's overactive. And we have symptoms like being moody, negative moods, and you have a startled response. You ever know anybody that experienced trauma or has PTSD? A lot of people who fought in the war have PTSD. You can come up behind them and they have a startled effect. But this explains why, when reminded of trauma, some people are thrown into rage or even about to break down and come into tears when they're exposed. So that's about how trauma affects the brain. And I broke it down that way because I needed you guys to really understand how it affects physically the shape of your brain, and it affects your emotions, and it affects your ability to sometimes function. I think when we think about trauma, we think, okay, it's a bad event, and you just need to get over it. It's not that simple. And that's why I broke it down, the fact that how it really affects your brain, the operation and the functioning of your actual brain. So how it affects the body. Insomnia, night terrors, nightmares, fatigue, being startled easily, difficulty concentrating, racing heartbeats, muscle tensions. You ever wake up sometimes and you just sore all over? You can't explain it. You didn't jog 5 miles or anything, but you got body aches. high blood pressure, and increased sugar levels, particularly dangerous if you're diabetic. So what do these symptoms look like in my everyday life? We all know somebody that, and I've been dealing with this, or thinking, from people at work who, they have this notion, well, that's just the way so-and-so is, and that's okay. And so we all know somebody that's kind of moody all the time, or cranky all the time, or they're just abrasive. But emotional and psychological symptoms of trauma is shock, disbelief, confusion, anger, rage, irritability. Every little thing irritates you. Mood swings, guilt, shame, self-blame. I can't tell you how many times victims that I've had to deal with blame themselves for the abuse that occurred. If anybody's ever been a victim of trauma, I just gave you the definition of trauma. Raise your hand if you've ever blamed yourself for what happened to you. Right. Withdrawing from others. Sometimes when we're going through changes, you'll have people, how they cope is they withdraw. They shut out the world. Feeling sad, feeling hopeless, depressed, feeling disconnected to reality and numb, which is very dangerous. Because when you don't feel, then what? So, recovery tips. Tip 1 for me, don't seclude yourself, okay? Prayer, ask for support. That takes humility. A lot of us struggle with that, to let somebody know. And some of us also has, I don't want everybody in my business, whether it be family or somebody close to you, because they embarrass them. Reconnect with people who genuinely love and care for you. Now, I'm not talking about the friend or the family member who, as soon as you tell them something, everybody in social media or everybody else knows. That's not what I'm talking about. Use wisdom, okay?
Right.
I'm talking about the people that you know genuinely love and care for you.
Right.
Support group. Mindfulness. Be present in the moment. And I've said this probably earlier in my career as a therapist. How you feel is how you feel. It is what it is. Okay? No one gets to tell you how you feel. Okay? How you feel is how you feel. Be in the moment. Because if you deny it, and if you put a band-aid on something that needs sutures and stitches, then you really aren't trying to, you're not healing.
Right.
Okay? Relaxation. What relaxes you? Me would be, go ahead, baby, what relaxes you? What? Laying down? Right, lay down.
Music.
Music, absolutely.
Yes.
Hot baths? Maybe a sauna, yes, baby? Cleaning up? Yeah. Yeah. I wish your auntie was here. She would be like, yeah. Everything gotta be just so. But do something that relaxes you. Self-care is critical when it comes to dealing with trauma. Get healthy. Get restful sleep. How many of us are cranky when we don't get enough sleep? Everybody ain't saying I need to go up. Or whether sleep is interrupted. I'm working on 2 days of no sleep. But I'm not cranky. Avoid self-medicating. I can't tell you how many times people want to take the matters into their own hands and decide, okay, I'm going to self-medicate. And self-medicating doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to turn to drugs or alcohol. You can become promiscuous. I talked about that, multiple partners. You're self-medicating. all the hurt, the pain. You're in pain. But you don't want to admit it. Admitting it takes humility.